NATO expansion is recognized, at least by Donald Trump, as one of the root causes, then the presence of the troops from NATO countries under any flag in any capacity on Ukrainian soil is the same threat.
We agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but our position is based on the assumption that the ceasefire would lead to a long-term peace.
Well, we'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia, and we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost, and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant, and who's going to get this and that? And so, it's not an easy process. But phase one is the ceasefire. A lot of the individual subjects have been discussed, though. We've been discussing concepts of land because you don't want to waste time with the ceasefire if it's not going to mean anything. So we're saying, look, this is what you can get, this is what you can't get. They discussed NATO and being in NATO, and everybody knows what the answer to that is. They've known that answer for 40 years, in all fairness.
Okay, folks, so we're getting some word. Sky News dropping some analysis out. Ivor Bennett, who is their Moscow correspondent over there, saying in his view, Putin doesn't appear to show any signs of compromise. I just want to read this from Sky News. It says Vladimir Putin was never going to flat out reject the U.S. proposal for a ceasefire, but he also wasn't going to fully endorse it. If he does agree, if Russia does agree, it will come with strings attached. The Kremlin leader didn't specify Moscow's demands, but he did allude to them by saying that the peace deal had to eliminate, quote, the root causes of the conflict. It became a frequent refrain of his and shows that Moscow's maximalist position hasn't changed. This is, of course, referring to NATO's eastward expansion, which he blames as the catalyst for the war in Ukraine. And, of course, by the way, it also, and we have a little bit of a readout here as well, they were talking about, Putin was talking about the fact that there are 1,200 miles of front line currently in the Ukraine war between Russia and Ukraine. That's about the distance from New York to Miami, almost the entire East Coast. And he's also asking questions about who's going to guarantee the ceasefire, who's going to monitor the agreement for violations, what is the authority, is there an international peace, is it sensors, how does it work, drones, etc. And of course, Vladimir Putin visiting Kursk, the region, just a few hours ago, really just yesterday, wearing fatigues for the first time since the war began, and donning those after a strong, very strong Russian victory in the Kursk region, mirroring, of course, though on a much smaller scale, the great Battle of Kursk in World War II, which is fought over the very same terrain, although in that case you had upwards of 2.2 million soldiers, both from the Nazis and the Soviets combined, as well as about 6,000 armored vehicles, 6,000 tanks. And so I want to bring Gavin Wax back in here. Gavin, President Trump, I think, understands the overall peace picture here and understands that ultimately the biggest players in this are not NATO and Ukraine, the way the media would have us believe, but it really kind of does come down to a proxy fight between the U.S. and Russia. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he understands that this is great power politics, and the only two state actors that matter are the United States and Russia. And I think the Russians recognize that. I think the Europeans are obviously upset about that. But at the end of the day, they're pretty much vassal states of the United States at this point. They don't really have any military, capabilities to speak of. Their economy is a fraction of what ours is, and they may be, trying to recreate a European Grand Army under Macron and trying to revitalize German military industry. But this is all far too little, far too late. They were never in a position to be dictating the terms of this conflict, certainly not the terms of peace. This was always going to be a discussion between the United States and Russia or a man-to-man between President Trump and Putin, and that's what we're beginning to see. And I think, look, as time goes on, it's becoming clear that this conflict is unwinnable for the Ukrainians, and the position of the West and the position of the United States needs to be, how do we come to the table and get the best possible deal for both Ukraine and the West? And I think that's what we're going to have to discuss at the negotiating process. There are obviously some red lines that Russia and Putin have drawn, and where they're willing to acquiesce and where they're not is going to be determined through this process. But at least we're having this process, which in and of itself is a massive development from the past few years of no communication, no talks, and no sign of peace on the horizon.
Well, and that's really what it's all about, because this is something where, look, I think that a lot of people were saying, oh, Putin's going to agree to the ceasefire and this is going to, the ball's in his court and he's going to agree right away. But when it really comes down to it, that's not how these types of negotiations usually work. Typically with negotiations like this, at the end of any big conflict, you're going to have the leaders get together. You're going to have of course, a framework that'll be agreed to by the envoy. So that's Mark Rutte from the NATO side. That's Witkoff going to the Russians to get their information. That's Lavrov putting out his process. That's also, by the way, the Secretary of State and Waltz meeting with the Ukrainians and their interlocutors there in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. But this really isn't going to come into effect until we see a meeting between the leaders of the United States, the leaders of Russia, and the leaders of Ukraine. And who knows, right? Who knows how that's going to look or even where that would take place. I think one of the reasons personally that they can't use Istanbul anymore is that Erdogan has turfed himself out because he's taken so much of a line with the Ukrainians in terms of this, that Putin doesn't necessarily look at him as an impartial player in the conflict. He's someone who's been completely on board with NATO, obviously being a NATO member, but also completely on board with the Ukrainian war effort and selling those Bayraktar drones and so many others. Of course, he can point to keeping the Dardanelles closed and the Bosphorus, the lines to the Black Sea, and keeping with the Montreux Treaty from the early 1900s, World War I era treaty. But at the end of the day, he's taken a side in the conflict. So that's why they're going down to Saudi Arabia for all of this, because the Saudis, if anything, haven't really taken a side one way or the other. So they've got the ability to be neutral ground. But when it really all comes to the same deal with, by the way, with pretty much everywhere in Europe, with the exception of Hungary. And so the idea moving forward then is, if we're going to see a peace, and Gavin, let's even pull it back even further. Let's pull it back way further, because President Trump, and I keep saying this, the tariffs are connected to the foreign policy. The tariffs, NATO, foreign policy, our relationship with Europe, it's all deeply interconnected. And we've been talking about this here on Human Events Daily. The media is never going to get this. I think this goes, honestly, Gavin, you've talked to reporters the way I do. This stuff goes right over their heads. They have no idea. They look at one lane as economic, one lane as military. They can't actually see the connection. What President Trump is trying to do is wind down the globalist American empire project.